All right, guys. So today we're going to be early dynasties of ancient China and the early development of their civilization. So, like we were saying last week, China is a river valley civilization, much like the civilization on the Indus River Valley, along the Nile River Valley, and in Mesopotamia in the Fertile Crescent. So, they start realizing that the soil along the riverbanks is fertile. The silt deposited on the banks of the river makes for great farming, and so as early as 7,000 BC, they are growing rice on the Yangtze riverbanks. And in the river valley. So separate cultures do develop from in the southern and northeastern portions of China. Oh, look, there's a typo there. There's a few typos on here. My apologies. I make these myself, and sometimes I don't always catch my mistakes. Now, like the Egyptians, the Chinese, their early tombs and things of that nature have a lot of items. Those tombs hold more items and better than others, so that suggests that there's a social order early in Chinese history prior to the development of things like writing and record keeping and whatnot. So moving on, we're going to talk about China's first dynasty, which may or may not actually have existed. Jia dynasty, I'm not sure exactly if I'm saying that right, is sort of a legendary first dynasty. We haven't been able to fully conclude if they did or did not exist. For a very long time, we've considered them to be just a legend, but there is some possibility are, in fact, a real dynasty that did exist, that did rule China. We just really don't have evidence one way or the other. So this very early dynasty, supposedly, and according to the legends, was begun by a man named the Great, who was one of the early He built waterways, according to the stories, to help floodwaters drain into the ocean. And China depends pretty heavily on waterways between different rivers and things like that. So if this is true, then he would have done something that was very important and very beneficial for his people. And instead of being a conqueror, he's an engineer. But we're not sure, again, one way or the other, if Yu the Great even existed. The Shang dynasty, however, is a verifiable dynasty that we do know existed. It's the first dynasty we have actual evidence of, and you can see to the right of your screen the territory that the Shang dynasty actually controlled. Like I said, you'll notice that not all of these dynasties, or most of these dynasties, didn't control all of what we know as China. They were smaller lands that were under their control. So the Shang are established by the 1500s BC, and they're strongest in the Yangtze River Valley. They moved their capital several times, probably to avoid floods or enemy attacks. Like I was saying, the Yangtze River floods rather often, often to devastating effect, and so it would make sense that they might have had to move their capital in order to avoid those floodwaters. We're going to talk this chapter about several different dynasties, and you do need to know the difference between them. I recommend anytime we do a new dynasty, you get its own header in your notes, and you jot down useful information about each, things like social structure, the dates for that dynasty, that sort of thing. Any major developments in technology or accomplishments of that dynasty would be things that you want to focus on listing there as well. In the Shang dynasty, the king is the center of political and religious life. Beneath the king are advisors who are nobles. They give him advice on how to run the country, things of that nature. Now, the Shang did develop China's first writing system. You do need to make a note of that. That is important information. It would not have looked the same as the Chinese writing system today. In fact, there was a lack of uniformity across different regions in China until about the Qin dynasty. During this time, there would have been some different writing systems that popped up in different regions, so be aware of that. There isn't a uniform writing system until the Qin dynasty, but the very first of China's writing systems is developed during the Shang dynasty. As far as goods, items, things that they made, and technology, things like that, they created items out of bronze and jade. They developed chariots, had war bows, and developed bronze body armor. So you need to make a note of those technological developments. And also the years of the Shang dynasty, which on this map is 1523 to 1028 BC. So make a note of that, please. So, as far as the social order in China, it is not quite the same from one dynasty to the next, so you will need to be familiar with the social order of several different dynasties. This particularly shows the Shang dynasty's social hierarchy. The king is at the top, followed by nobles, warrior leaders from the further regions and reaches of the developing country, then artisans, people who make pottery, clothing, tools, and weapons, farmers, being almost at the very bottom. They work very long hours, they don't have very much pay, and they're very much overtaxed during the Shang dynasty. Hang on, Megan, let me think about that for a second. And then at the very bottom would have been slaves. So your question is, said that the lords got land. Does that mean that they were landlords? Yes, not in the way that we would mean landlords. They are lords that own this land. Often people might work that land for them, depending on which dynasty we are specifically talking about. So sometimes people just own that land themselves. Okay. And sometimes they tend to sort of assign pieces of the land that they own to other people to work or farm. It just depends kind of on the situation. All right, so like I was saying, royal families at the top, nobles followed by warrior leaders, artisans, and then farmers at the very, very bottom. Farmers lose most of their income to taxes during the Shang dynasty, so they're very much underpaid, definitely at the bottom of the social hierarchy. Now, this is, again, not going to be exactly the same for some later dynasties. One of the later dynasties we'll talk about, the farmers actually hold a much higher position in the social hierarchy, and so you need to be aware of the difference between these different dynasties and their social orders. That brings us to a new dynasty, the Zhao dynasty. In the 1100s BC, the leader of a group of people who came to be known as the Zhao ruled over a kingdom in China. Okay, now the Zhao worked with nearby tribes and overthrew the Shang dynasty. Now, the Zhao dynasty lasts a very long time, from 1122 BC to 221 BC, so you need to make a note of those dates. And you need to be familiar with something called the mandate of heaven. And this is, for some reason, not an actual vocabulary word, although if I was making your text it would be a vocab word. And that's because this concept appears regularly throughout Chinese history. It is the notion that heaven gives leaders the right to rule. And if those leaders fail to fulfill their responsibilities as worthy rulers, the mandate of heaven can be passed to other people, giving them to the right to overthrow past dynasties and establish new ones, which is why we see an overturn of dynasties relatively regularly in Chinese history as compared to Japanese history, where the line of emperors has never been broken. The Chinese believe that a ruler can lose the right to lead their people, and therefore that right can be passed on to more worthy rulers. And that's what happened with the Zhao dynasty. They claim the mandate of heaven, claim that they have the emperor is not fulfilling his responsibilities, and so they have the right, the responsibility even, to overthrow that emperor and establish a new dynasty. Please make a note of the mandate of heaven, put a star by it, and make sure that you emphasize that. That is an important concept that you need to be aware of this chapter. And in any future chapters that we do on later Chinese history, it's going to come up again. So basically, the Zhao say that the Shang dynasty, they're not doing what they're supposed to do. They're not good leaders, so we have a right to overthrow them. So, Zhao social order. The Zhao established a system that we refer to as feudalism. You need to be familiar with what feudalism is. It will come up in several different societies. And the basic concept is that the king grants land to lords. The lords have vassals who swear loyalty to them and serve them. The lords are responsible for providing soldiers to the king to defend the land when necessary. And then also the lords usually allow peasants or serfs to work that land, giving them a small plot of land and that they have to farm. And then they also had to farm additional land for the noble who owned it in Zhao society. So it typically benefits the kings and the lords pretty nicely within feudalism, but people at the bottom, the farmers, the serfs, that's a term that will come up later, is SERFS. We use it more regularly within like European history. But it's the same basic concept. They're at the bottom of society. They work land for the nobles, and they're beholden to those nobles. Beneath the emperor are lords. You need to be familiar with this feudalism system. There's a sort of responsibility of the lords to provide these soldiers to the king, and then to provide land for peasants to work and farm as well. And then they take a portion of that the crops that those peasants would grow. Yeah, so put a star beside feudalism. That concept is going to come up. You need to understand and know what feudalism is. Did that make sense to everyone? Do I need to re-explain that? We'll see feudalism again in Japanese history. We'll see feudalism in European history in multiple regions. So it's an important term that you need to be familiar with, and it was definitely a part of the Zhao social hierarchy. Now, the Zhao system does bring order to China. The ruling lords help the Zhao emperor control distant areas. So he can spread out a bit, and he can control further reaches of the country just because he has these lords working for him and governing in his name. However, the political system ends up breaking down eventually. The descendants of those original lords that were loyal to the emperor aren't necessarily as loyal to the emperor. They start to gain more power over the lands that they control. Their vassals swear loyalty to them. And so eventually a time comes where the emperor calls for troops from his lords, and they don't really send any. And so he won't be able to fight off invaders because the people who are supposed to be providing an army for him, they don't. So in 771 BC, invaders reached the capital of the Zhao dynasty. The Zhao do lose that battle. The dynasty does survive, but their power is significantly diminished. China fractures into smaller states controlled by different families. They're no longer one unified Zhao country, and the Zhao do continue to control a portion of of China for a while, but they're no longer in control of the majority of the territory. If you look to the right of your screen, you'll see the different states that the government fractured into during this time period, which we call the Warring States of China. This starts around 260. Well, this particular picture is around 260 BC, but this Warring States period was already happening by about 481 BC. So it lasts for a few hundred years. Armies fight each other in civil wars. Armies loyal to these different states start fighting each other for territory. It's a brutal time period. We see a breakdown in social order. We see a breakdown in relationships between families, between loyalty of kings and vassals and their servants. And so it's kind of a very chaotic period for China, this Warring States period. Which actually gives rise to something called Confucianism. Hopefully you all have heard of Confucius before. During the late Zhao period, a philosopher by the name of Confucius, and yes, this is a real person that we're talking about, develops ideas that will, he believes, restore order to China. And these philosophical ideas become what we know as Confucianism. It has some aspects of religion in it, but Confucianism is really more a philosophy than a religion. There are elements of things like reverence for your ancestors that definitely play a part in Confucianism, but it really focuses more on your relationships with the people around you. For example, the relationship between a father and a son, the relationship between a king and his servants, his lords. All of these things are a part of Confucianism and things that he believed were sort of the building blocks of society. If relationships aren't done right, if they're not properly supported, and the people in those relationships don't fulfill their duties to one another, then he believes that society breaks down. He suggested that China is overrun with rude and dishonest people, which, let's be fair, you know, there's a whole lot of rude and dishonest people out there, so I'd believe it. And he believed that the Chinese needed to return to ethics, to ethical behavior, loyalty, and like loyalty to your friends, loyalty to the father of your family, loyalty to the Lord or the emperor. All of those things had kind of broken down during this Warring States period. He stresses that a person's proper place in society, or that a person is obligated to fulfill their proper place in society, and how to maintain proper relationships between different people. And he thinks that if he restores these sort of fundamental ideas and relationships, that he can restore order to China. Actually, I'd encourage you to go back into the student-paced version of the Nearpod and watch that video. It's about Confucius. It's about Confucius. it's not going to stream very well, so I'm going to let you just watch that on your own. This is a basic breakdown of the 5 relationships of Confucianism, father to son, and we refer to this virtue associated with this as filial piety, proper reverence and respect for your father. A father has a responsibility to be a strong leader for their family, and sons have a responsibility to be loyal to their father. To the degree that your loyalty to your family and to your father should outweigh your loyalty to things like law. And so there was one example Confucius gave that spoke of, like, if a father commits a crime and steals something, his children have a responsibility to cover for him and to protect him. So, like, it's extreme loyalty to your family. The other relationships, ruler subject, to the appropriate virtue that is associated with that would be your loyalty to your ruler, and the ruler's responsibilities to his people. A brother to brother, husband and wife, love and obedience. Yes, women are subservient in China, in ancient China especially. They are not considered or treated equally to men. That is pretty standard across most ancient civilizations. And so women are expected to absolutely obey the husband, and the husband is expected to treat family and his wife with love and kindness. And then the relationship of friend to friend, your faithfulness to your friends, all of those things are the main relationships that Confucius focused on in his philosophy. He said that fathers should show high moral values, inspire their families. It's the duty of children to obey and respect their elders, which is where this concept, or this is related to the concept of the reverence for and almost worship of ancestors that we see in Chinese society. That's a very old practice that was common across much of the society's history, across civilization's history. And Confucianism supports that, this idea that you are supposed to have a lot of reverence and respect for your elders, even those that have passed on. All family members should be loyal to each other, to the degree that I already mentioned that. But if a father steals something, the children have a duty to cover for him and to protect him from the punishments for those crimes. And then in relation to government, he says that moral leadership, not laws, bring order. So